Hello everyone, this is part 35 of What If Naruto Was Like the Sage of Six Paths, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Taruho. Shion was shocked at the appearance of her attendant before a scowl shot across her face, her hands clenching into fists. You idiot! What are you doing here? She stormed towards the kindly-looking man, fists raised up in front of her to pound on his knee petulantly. However, she didn't make it more than 3 steps before a sudden invisible force seemed to wrap around her entire body, wrenching her back quickly, but not uncomfortably so. She could only look up in shock as she found herself in the arms of Naruto, at least until he set her to the side gently. I would not do that, Miko-sama. Shion only took a moment to get over her brief confusion, a new scowl sliding across her face as she stared angrily up at the other blonde. What are you doing, monk? I may not have wanted Taruho here. She sent a glare at the man that had him sheepishly rubbing the back of his head, as he would be nothing but a burden to us, however he is still my attendant. Naruto's face remained unchanged though as he stared evenly at the young man, Rinnegan eyes unblinkingly watching his form. No, he isn't. The brown-haired man adjusted his glasses with a look of confusion evident across his kindly features. I am confused, monk-san. He shook his head quickly, a seemingly genuinely perplexed look on his face as he looked over to Shion. I am merely Taruho, attendant to Shion-sama. I only wish to bring her back to the safety of her guards and attendants. His gaze hardened slightly, surprising Shion as she had never seen Taruho express anything remotely resembling a stern loom before. The priestess should not be traveling with escorts that are not of her personal guard. Slowly he drew the sword out of the sheath on his back, holding it confidently out in front of him like a true samurai. Taruho, what are you doing? Shion couldn't believe her eyes. Taruho had always been a man to peacefully settle things first, never to begin with violence as a means to an end. Ignore him, Miko-sama, he is not your attendant. The paler blonde looked around, staring up into Naruto's rippled eyes for a few seconds as Taruho continued to point his sword threateningly in the direction. Why do you keep saying that? How can you be so sure? Naruto simply smiled softly at the younger blonde as he gestured off in a seemingly random direction from the clearing. Because he is. A blurry form suddenly stumbled into the clearing, revealing the panting and slightly sweaty form of the real Taruho, looking incredibly out of breath from both his sprint here and from whatever Shion had put into his drink. Shion-sama. He is an imposter. The pale-haired girl just stared at the two identical men for a few moments before taking a hesitant step back towards Naruto. The monk simply looked between the two before smirking at the first of the men to catch up to them. It's a good henge, you'll admit, but my eyes aren't so easily fooled. The first Taruho's kindly smile quickly devolved into a scowl as his features melted away, revealing the white-haired man that Naruto could have sworn he sent into a trench earlier, Kusuna. Well, that was to be expected, I suppose. You are strong after all. He glanced about the clearing before grinning cruelly. Now, faster than any civilian could have possibly reacted, or even seen, the 3 other men of the gang of 4 that had assaulted Shion's temple leapt from the trees. Luckily Naruto was no civilian and with a disinterested glance simply widened his eyes a little. Almost immediately the 3 shinobi found their jump stopped by some invisible barrier keeping them suspended in the sky, but only for a split moment. Shinra Tensei. All of a sudden the 3 other men of the group found out just what had happened to Kusuna back at the temple as they were forcibly expelled from the area by invisible blasts of pure gravitational force. However, all Shion or the other members of Naruto's group felt were slight breezes from the powerful technique. The white-haired leader of the quartet simply stared at the monk in shock, disbelieving that he could so casually get rid of his 3 dark chakra-empowered companions without even moving. What are you? He took a hesitant step back from the younger blonde as Naruto looked around, leveling a steady, unwavering stare at the servant of Maryu. I don't know what you mean, Shinobi-san. I am nothing more than a simple monk. When he finished speaking he smiled kindly, his eyes narrowing into unnervingly innocent s. Kusuna just took another step back, his eyes widened with fear now. It was like some unspeakably horrific enemy had just appeared behind Naruto, like a great Hanya mask that stared at him as a visage of pure terror. Why, you're not human. The white-haired shinobi darted from the clearing suddenly in a shunshin, his movements nothing but a blur of motion. However, Naruto's eyes followed him anyway, even as he lazily raised a hand in the man's direction. Banshu Tenon. There was a moment's pause before the white-haired shinobi's surprised and fearful yell echoed in the clearing. Not a second later he had flown back towards the group, landing roughly in a trench by Naruto's feet, black eyes locked on the teen's form with fear. Naruto, though, simply maintained his innocent, kindly smile as he gently crouched down, making sure to look the man in the eyes. You know, I would very much appreciate it if you and your companions would stop attacking us. We have something very important to do and it is more of an inconvenience than anything. Kusuna just continued to stare up at him, his breathing ragged, his body felt paralyzed as he stared up into those deep, ringed eyes, as if he were drowning in them. All right. Naruto just nodded happily, even though the air was still tense as if at any moment the entire clearing would just explode. All right then, you can go now. It seemed Kusuna needed no further encouraging as he scrambled to his feet, once again darting from the area without so much as a backwards glance at the group. There was a few moments of terse silence before Naruto turned, bearing a more genuine, but no less intimidating smile as he casually walked through the group. Shall we continue on then? The group stared at him oddly for a few moments, especially Taruho and Shion, but after a few seconds of deliberating, or in Fu's case not a moment's hesitation, they followed after him. So you are saying you failed me? The four shinobi knelt in front of a regal-looking tent, big enough for one person. The man that sat inside on an intricate seat fit for a king looked pallid and unhealthy, his dark hair slick on his sweaty skin as he spoke with a wavering, croaky voice. However, his eyes were deep and dark, burning with energy and power as he glared at his subordinates. You couldn't even bring me a single, weak little priestess. The four kneeling shinobi flinched at his harsh tone, as if his voice was wavering between two different speakers. Finally Kusuna gathered up his courage and looked up, only to immediately regret it as he felt the force of his master's chakra bear down on his like a physical presence. It was the monk Yomi-sama. He was too powerful for us. Yomi simply glared at the man who dared to say the power he had bestowed them wasn't enough for a single, lowly monk. He was about to rebuke the man before a low, whispering voice in the recesses of his mind convinced him otherwise. He grunted irritably instead. What monk? Kusuna let out a deep, relieved breath at not being torn apart before looking up again, avoiding looking into his master's dark, unwavering eyes. He didn't look special, but he has great power. He could send us flying away from him without even moving, using strange techniques I have never heard of. Yomi's eyes narrowed as the whispering voice in his mind became louder, more demanding. What was the name of this technique? Kusuna frowned, wondering what his master's fascination with this monk was. He was powerful, but in the shinobi's mind there was nobody stronger than Yomi, especially as he bore the spirit of Maryu within him. He racked his mind for a moment, trying to think what he had heard from the boy as he casually blasted his companions away with ease. It was Shinra Tensei. Yomi's eyes widened for a split second before grasping his head in pain, crying out as the whispering voice became more of a scream. The four shinobi saw their master's distress and were about to get to their feet to see what was wrong when his eyes snapped open again, effectively freezing them all in place. His eyes weren't human anymore, the dark of his iris having spread to the entirety of his eyes, giving him a demonic visage. So they have resurfaced again. His voice was raspy and disjointed, like it wasn't quite his own. However, the moment passed and a second later Yomi blinked and his eyes were his own again. He shook his head, wincing at the loud voice in the dark of his mind screamed at him. He looked up when he realized he had been silent for a good minute and the four shinobi were staring at him with worry and confusion. Go. Destroy the priestess. Do not fail me or Maryu-sama again. Kusuna nodded hesitantly as the other three shinobi darted off, glad to be away from their master while he was in this mood. However, the white-haired medic Nin hesitated for a moment. Yomi-sama, what do we do about the monk? The dark-haired man looked up, still looking incredibly sickly, despite the enormous waves of power radiating off him. Nothing. When the time comes I will deal with him myself, just make sure that if they reach the sealing ground, he enters alone. His glare intensified as Kusuna felt a cold sweat break out over his form. The others are expendable, do you understand me? Do what you have to, but make sure the monk is alone. Kusuna quickly nodded, taking a step back from the glaring man. Of course, Yomi-sama. And with that he vanished from in front of the tent in a blur of motion, leaving the possessed man to his thoughts and machinations. Slowly Yomi's face slid into a sickening grin as darkness once again overtook his eyes, a thin mist of potent purple chakra radiating off his body. Yes, this is perfect. Naruto sat quietly on the edge of a large canyon, just staring out over the rushing waters far below him. The sky was dark overhead now, so the group had decided to set up camp, and much to the protests of Shien that had included Taruho. Despite her claims he was simply a burden and would slow them down, considering the fact that they were just walking to Numa no Kuni, he didn't slow them down at all. In fact, the young attendant had been rather worried they wouldn't make it in time. Naruto had simply told him to have faith in the sealing abilities of Shien's mother. Ah, Monk-san. Naruto didn't make a sound as the very same attendant came walking up beside him, sitting down next to the blonde and staring at him for a few moments. Yes, Taruho. How could I help you? The brown-haired man faltered for a moment at the peaceful and serene tone the young teen used. It sounded so out of place on somebody so young, as if belonging to a much older, wiser man. I would like to apologize for Shien-sama's behavior towards you and your friends. She has a hard time voicing her gradient. The man trailed off as Naruto absently lifted a hand, placing it on his shoulder and quietening him for the moment. There is no need for you to apologize on her behalf, Taruho. The attendant looked around in slight confusion at the blonde, making the teen chuckle. You might just think of me as a teenager, or a sheltered monk, but trust me, I understand. He sighed, the humor leaving his voice as he stared out over the water raging below them, so contrasting to the perfectly still night air. Shien had a very lonely childhood, didn't she? Taruho's eyes widened in surprise, but he nodded all the same, his own tone becoming somber as he thought back to the early days when he first became Shien's personal attendant. Lady Shien, like all the priestesses of Oni no Kuni before her, has the limited ability to see into the future. At that, Naruto raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He could hardly talk when it came to strange, otherworldly abilities that should be impossible. She gained small glimpses into the future of those around her, allowing her to see the deaths before they happen with 100% accuracy. This time it was Naruto's eyes that widened before his face darkened a little, his eyes turning down. And let me guess, people avoided her, fearing that she would foresee the deaths. They would stay away from her because of a power she had from birth that she had no control over having. Taruho looked up, still surprised by this strange, oddly understanding monk. Yes. Other children were warned away from her by their parents out of fear, and despite the respect they had for her and her mother, they didn't want to risk her abilities turning on them. Taruho frowned, seeing very familiar look in the blonde's eyes he recognized from back when Shien wasn't so good at concealing her emotions. You speak of all this as though from experience, Monk-san. Naruto looked back round, the mirth back in his eyes as he concealed his previous slip with a small smile. Thank you, Taruho, I think I understand better now. Languidly he stood up, stretching out his back as he looked up at the twinkling stars above them. But we should be getting back. It is late and we have a long journey ahead of us tomorrow. He looked down, seeing that Taruho was staring at him with just a hint of worry in his eyes. You shouldn't worry so much, Taruho, it'll add years to your face, we'll pick up the pace tomorrow, I swear. With that the young blonde turned and walked back towards the camp, leaving Taruho alone to look out over the valley before he too stood and returned to his rightful place by Shien's side. Ah, no, put me down. This is too fast. Ah. Shien's screams and wails of protests were only slightly muffled by the raging river that could be heard nearby as the group dashed quickly across the forest floor. Behind them Taruho valiantly struggled to keep up with them, but Naruto made sure their pace was slow enough for him to stay with the group. However, despite the obvious exertion it put on the man, he never spoke out, merely running along with stoic silence, ever alert for dangers to Shien. The priestess on the other hand wasn't nearly as quiet over her discomfort, still riding along of Tayuya's back, who, once again, was the last one up. Pipe down, thoroughbred, you're going to scare off the birds with those banshee cries. Shien could only manage a small glare before he was forced to grab tightly onto the redhead's shoulders as Tayuya jumped clear across a small valley. Ah, slow down or put me down. She was having to shout over the winds rushing past them as the group continued to sprint through the thick forest. Tayuya just grinned viciously, having had nearly enough of being screamed at for the entire morning, although a part of her was rather impressed Shion had managed to keep shouting for this long. I'll put you down all right if you keep screaming at me, princess. Shion blanched a little as she glanced down at the forest floor rushing by beneath the redhead's feet, almost a blur to her untrained eyes. Taruho. Taruho, help me. This maniac is going to drop me. Taruho. However, it wasn't Taruho that appeared next to the two girls, instead it was Naruto, calmly placing a hand on Tayuya's shoulder as they came to a stop next to a large oak tree. It's alright, Tayuya'll carry her for a bit. The redhead didn't even argue, simply shrugging the blonde priestess off her back, much to the girl's surprise as she suddenly fell towards the earth. What are you doing? She found her voice suddenly losing its confidence as she tried to withdraw into her jacket, looking oddly like a turtle as she did so. Come on, we need to catch up with the group. Shion just nodded, doing her best to fight back the blush spreading over her features as Naruto took off to catch up to the others. In contrast to Tayuya's rougher, bumpier sprint, the Miko found Naruto to be a much more comfortable ride. He just seemed to glide along the ground like it was ice, and even the wind rushing by didn't seem to bother them, as if it were being bent around their forms. However, after a few minutes she broke out of her reverie over her new chauffeur's carrying ability as she noticed they hadn't caught up to the group yet. Monk. Naruto just nodded slowly, his eyes darting about as he reached out with his senses through the moisture in the air. I know, don't worry about them. In truth, Shion hadn't been thinking about the others, but for some reason she didn't want to disappoint the blonde, so she said nothing. You can come out now. However, the blonde's only answer was a sudden attack from below as those same sickly-looking purple snakes burst from the ground attempting to ensnare him and the priestess. In a blur of motion though, he vanished from between the entwining creatures, appearing up on a tree branch as he gently let Shion down and turned to her in a crouch. Stay up here, I'll be right back. He jumped back down to the forest floor just in time to land on one of the fleshy snakes, crushing its head beneath his sandal. So confident. However, I know your abilities now, monk. You won't defeat me so easily, I'm afraid. The voice seemed to echo out around the small clearing, surrounding the blonde to confuse him. Kusuna was annoyed though when the monk's steely ringed eyes landed directly on him, even in his hiding place. You don't know anything of my abilities. Kusuna only had time to widen his eyes and leap back before a great fist of sand came down to crush the branch he had been hiding on. Strange blue vein-like marking lined the sandy hand, which as all the shinobi saw before it harmlessly dispersed into particles. He realized too late it had been a diversion before he was sent rocketing back by a great invisible blast that shook his bones and launched him no more than a few trees. A moment later Naruto landed in the crater his body had dug, watching as the shinobi picked himself up, bones and skin knitting together even as he watched. You can't defeat me, monk. Maryu-sama's gift flows through me. No matter what damage you do, I will simply heal from it. Naruto gained a serene but intimidating smile as he began casually rolling up the sleeves of his open robe, not wanting to dirty it as he only had the one. Okay, let's test that. Fu sighed in irritation as she leapt from the ground, watching with mildly curious eyes when the earth beneath her split apart as a razor-sharp blade of water rushed through it. She recognized the technique from the Kiri Rebellion, Suten, Mizu Kamakiri. It was dangerous to those unprepared for it. However, to her eyes and reflexes it was almost painfully slow, even if the shinobi was using it in slightly creative ways. Underneath her the S-blade of water suddenly doubled back, aiming to hit her when she touched back down. However, she didn't give it the chance as wings sprouted from her back at the zenith of her jump. If this is all the power you can bring, you might as well hold still and let me deal with you now. I have to get back to Naruto's side. As if answering her call, her opponent appeared on a tree branch across from her, the orange-haired one with the 3 vertical blue markings on his face like war paint. Such confidence and dedication. Fu frowned when she felt his eyes wandering over her body, grimacing as a tongue came out to lick his lips lecherously, not to mention your abilities, so unique. Fu recollected her expression as her wings brought her lower to touch down on a branch, folding back into nothingness. Her eyes narrowed as the man continued to stare at her body, her hands coming up to rush through a multitude of hand seals. Do you wish to see a true water technique? Her hand stopped as water from the air as well as what was left over from the man's last technique congealed behind her. Suten, Koku no Jutsu. The gathering water behind her suddenly exploded upwards, confusing the orange-haired shinobi until that same water suddenly rained back down on him, now a dirty blackened color. He tried to avoid it, but it was like avoiding the rain, exactly like avoiding the rain in fact, and soon he was soaked in the surprisingly sticky black water. Hey, was that it, girlie? Was that all your little technique could do? Get me a little wet. Fu just stared at him with cold, dispassionate eyes as she held her hand up in the tiger seal, a small orange flame appearing on her outstretched index finger. Yes, now disappear. She touched her finger down and the man could only watch with surprise as the black, tar-like substance suddenly caught alight. The flames washed over the area in an instant, giving him no time to dodge or come up with a counter, and soon even the sounds of his screaming were lost behind the roar of the inferno. After a minute or so, Fu finally released the seal and the black water slowly vanished, taking the flames with it to reveal a blackened and scorched section of the forest as well as the shinobi lying at the center of it all. It's not enough, girlie, why you can't stop Maryu-sama. He'll see crush you all. The mint-haired Jinchuriki dropped down to where the man was twitching on the ground, covered in nasty burns and unable to move from the pain. His voice was choked and weak as he coughed pitifully from the smoke he had inhaled as he screamed. Fu merely stared at him coldly before walking off, leaving him there. She cared little for what happened to him as long as he was no longer a threat. Haku casually moved his head out of the way of the massive fists of the giant in front of him, backing up with his hands behind his back as he fluidly moved his body this way and that to avoid the powerful, but slow punches. He knew that even one of those blows landing on his body would be bad for him, despite his ability to heal himself if necessary. This was the man that had split up the group, attacking once Naruto had fell behind with Shion, crashing down like a meteor and causing the group to scatter or be caught up in the potent earth technique. Hold still, you little brat. Haku just raised an eyebrow as he skirted around the man again, appearing behind him faster than the man could follow. Speed had always been one of the Ice User's greatest strengths, and it had been a large focus of his studies during the 3 years on the island. After all, his reserves were too low for senjutsu training and he couldn't allow himself to fall behind his companions. I believe that would defeat the purpose of dodging. The man he was fighting, he believed his name was Jitai. If his semi-intelligible scream at the beginning of their fight was anything to go on, was like a berserker. Haku had to admit that while his attacks were slow, they were undoubtedly powerful, able to easily through trees with glancing blows. However, he was crazed and his pupils were heavily dilated, indicating some kind of performance enhancer or chakra boost. Haku knew that if he simply outlasted the man, he would use up whatever stimulant he was using and drop from the backlash. It wasn't an ideal solution considering he wanted to check how his friends were doing, but even after all this time he disliked violence. PFFT, running like a little girl, pathetic. Fight me, you coward. Haku almost laughed but maintained his cold outward expression, if the man though he was going to rise to a simple taunt. Damn it, hold still. I hate fighting girls, they never know how to fight properly. Haku's rational mind came to a grinding halt. Contrary to what people might think, he was actually very sensitive over his appearance, or at least he had become that way after so long of having Tayuya taunt him. Suddenly Jitai noticed the air becoming colder around him, his breath becoming visible as he shivered. What did you call me? He looked up, seeing that Haku was looking down, his long hair hanging in front of his face, shadowing his eyes menacingly. Jitai shrugged off the sudden chill in the air, grinning as he cracked his knuckles, not noticing as Haku began to run through one-handed seals. Hey, did I strike a nerve, girlie? The man grinned as he stepped forward, thinking his opponent had finally lost their nerve. In that he was unprepared as Haku finished his string of seals in a blur of finger movements that would have impressed the copy ninja. Hyoten, Samuke. Haku's voice went unheard as a whisper, but the thin layer of ice creeping over his hands didn't go unnoticed by the lumbering earth user. He caught the reflective gleam on the boy's hands and naturally tensed up for whatever technique he was about to use. Finally decided to fight serious, he froze mid-sentence, literally. Haku had vanished without even a blur, seemingly there one moment and gone the next. Over the next few seconds, Jitai felt the numerous small pats as Haku dashed around him, occasionally tapping at his vital points. However, the gentle taps were far from harmless, and with every touch ice slipped off the boy's hands, creeping over Gitai's form in mere moments. When Haku finally reappeared to the visible eye, it was over, and Jitai didn't even have time to cry out in surprise as the thin layer of chilling ice finished creeping over his entire body, freezing him there like a statue. I hate being called a girl. I'm just slightly feminine is all. Haku irritable blew a stray strand of hair from his face before stalking off, mumbling about irritating redheads as he disappeared into the foliage. Jitai just remained there, only able to move his eyes and breathe through the tiny gap in the ice Haku had left for his nose. He had a feeling he would be there for a while as he saw no sign of the ice beginning to melt under the sun. Ha, you call these shuriken? F pathetic. Tayuya taunted her own opponent as the two dashed through the trees. Sometimes the redhead would insult him further by casually running backwards. She would nimbly duck and weave as various shuriken, controlled by her opponent's wind technique, soared about her, trying to S her up. She couldn't be bothered to remember his name, especially if he didn't even challenge her in the slightest. Seriously, is this the best you got? Her opponent, who she could tell was normally the quiet, stoic type, was getting more and more riled up by her casual taunting. Futon, kamikaze. Setsuna rushed through his hand seals, pausing on the ram as he exhaled a mighty breath. Tayuya just raised an eyebrow as the huge gust of wind twisted and contorted until it had tuned into 3 great tornadoes of viciously rotating wind. The redhead simply grinned before the winds engulfed her, tearing at her body and causing arcs of her bee to become spattered on the trees they were racing through. Setsuna smirked as he saw his opponent be torn apart by his technique, at least until he heard he chuckling from somewhere behind him. That was it. Kami, you suck. He turned, wide-eyed as Tayuya emerged from the trees behind him, casually leaning on the trunk of a great oak. You don't even realize how outclassed you really are, do you? Setsuna growled, feeling his stoic facade disappearing under this mere girl's owe of demeaning taunts. However, as he reached up to run through more hand seals, her found his arms immobilized. Looking down, he was shocked to see his arms bound by dark, demonic-looking chains that stretched off into the darkness of the tree line, a similar situation to his legs. Suddenly Tayuya snapped her fingers and the chains went taut, painfully pulling at his limbs until he was awkwardly contorted into a spread eagle position. The redhead strode forward confidently, her long bee-colored hair flowing out behind her as horns seemed to sprout from her head, her eyes becoming a dark, menacing red. Idly she pulled a single, rather blunt-looking kunai from her kimono top and began picking at her nails with it as she grinned up at the bound man. Like I said, you're out of your league. She stopped picking her nails as she tossed the kunai from hand to hand, still grinning viciously as her visage became more and more demonic. Quote. Did you think you'd S? His smirk became even more cruel as she spanned the kunai by the hole at its grip. We're only just getting started. Birds scattered from the trees as the man's scream continued to echo through the forest, like music to Tayuya's ears. The redhead stood over her opponent's unconscious form, sliding her elegant metal flute back down to its resting place in her sea bindings and huffing with irritation. Damn, no challenge at all, falling for a weak genjutsu like that. She nudged the dark-haired man with her foot, hearing him whimper in his unconscious stupor as he rolled up into a tighter ball. The redhead grimaced as she took a step back from him. I think he pissed himself. She sighed as she took another step back, looking around at her surroundings and realizing she had no idea where she was. With another irritable sigh, she walked off into the trees, figuring she better get back to her friends before they came looking for her. Damn, guess I got a bit carried away. Naruto groaned with irritation as he crushed another of the disgusting fleshy snakes under his sandal. He had the displeasure to watch as what he thought was Kusuna's unconscious body dissolved into a small nest of the writhing, wriggling things. With another sigh, he casually wiped his sandal against the dusty ground, trying to get little bits of the purple creatures off his heel as he looked around the forest. He couldn't sense anybody else in the near vicinity, so he knew Kusuna had taken off at some point in the fight, or he hadn't been there at all. He was just unfortunate that with all the dark chakra in the shinobi's body he couldn't tell the clone from the original. Man, I hate clones. Naruto paused at that, feeling as though he had said something inherently hypocritical, yet he couldn't for the life of him fathom why. He shook his head of it as he walked from the clearing, not giving the crushed remains of the poisonous snakes a backwards glance. A few blurred jumps later and he had reached the tree branch he had left Shion on. Unfortunately, the pale blonde-haired priestess was nowhere to be seen. Naruto just ran hand through his hair as he looked about, sighing irritably. Would it K the girl to follow instructions? Shion stumbled again as her feet caught in the low bushes and awkwardly placed roots that littered the forest floor. She was no fool, she wasn't waiting around to be caught in the inevitable crossfire she had always heard erupted between people using chakra. However, as her clothes continued to be caught by low-hanging branches and irritating twigs, she began to regret breaking away from Naruto. She paused, coming to a stop in a particularly dense area of the forest where only a few meager rays of sunlight pathetically streamed in. Hello. She looked around, hoping to see a familiar face blur into existence nearby. Hell, even Tayuya would be a welcome sight right now. Monk. Her head whipped around when she heard a slight rustling behind her, only turning in time to see the bushes settle. From the wind. Yes, she convinced herself it had to be just the wind. She was letting the dark and the isolation get to her. She was a proud priestess of Oni no Kuni. She shouldn't let little things like her scream resonated around the area as a hand suddenly rested on her shoulder, causing her to spin around and naturally strike out at the perpetrator. However, she was surprised when her wrist was easily caught in a firm grip, her eyes going wide and beginning to brim with tears. Taruho. The young man smiled pleasantly at her when she rushed forward, burying her face in his sea. The man just smiled gently as he returned the hug, slowly wrapping his arms around her smaller frame. The young priestess never saw the thin purple snakes that emerged from the man's sleeves, rearing back slowly with the dripping fangs bared. Shion-sama. Similarly, the little fleshy snakes never saw the flash of the blade that separated their heads from their bee. The priestess looked around in shock as she felt the blade rush past her hair, pushing off of the Taruho holding her as another entered the clearing. Taruho. Shion stared in confusion as the two identical men glared across at one another, their swords raised in almost mirrored perfection. The young girl backed away from them, now unsure who her real attendant was. They both looked identical. Damn it, she wasn't a shinobi or a kunoichi, she couldn't detect a henge or whatever it was the monk had called it. Shion-sama, you have to get away for your own safety. One of the Taruhos looked to her while still keeping his sword trained on the other him. The other bespectacled man looked around as well, sowing the same concern in his brown eyes. Don't listen to that imposter Shion-sama, if you run away you'll be led right into their trap. The two men resumed glaring at one another as Shion stood still, indecisively, she didn't know what to do. Quiet you shinobis. The two men continued to adjust their stances in perfect mockeries of one another, lending no credit to either being the real Taruho. No, you be quiet, you pretender. Shion watched helplessly as the two men began to shuffle forward, keeping their stances level as they readied themselves to attack. Stop this, both of you. Both Taruhos froze in place as they looked around at the girl, both of them confused by her sudden outburst. Only one of you is the real Taruho, so I'm ordering you both to put down your blades. She surprised herself with the authority she managed to muster in her voice. It contrasted how weak and helpless she felt inside. However, to her dismay, neither of the brown-haired men made a move to comply with her demand. I am sorry, Shion-sama, but when your safety is at risk I must ignore your commands. Shion widened her eyes at one of the men before the other turned to her, just as much sincerity in his voice. I'm afraid the same goes for me, Shion-sama. And as if an unspoken signal had been given, the two samurai rushed forward, their identical blades meeting in a clash of sparks and metal. From there, Shion had trouble seeing what was going on. Taruho may not have been a shinobi, but he was a proud samurai before he had become her attendant, and he could use chakra to enhance his movements. Their blows became a blurs of movement, their feet almost vanishing as they twisted and turned around one another, vying for superiority. Finally they disengaged for a moment, one of them now bearing a few scratches across their arms and clothing. Your appearance may be a perfect duplicate, but you could never master the art of the sword like a true samurai. The injured Taruho just scowled as his features began to melt away, revealing the white-haired shinobi that had previously tried to perform the very same trick. This might have been amusing at first, but without that monk around it's pointless. Taruho merely set his features as he shifting his stance again, causing the white-haired shinobi to smirk viciously. Oh, this isn't a sword game anymore, boy, let me show you how shinobi fight. The man suddenly vanished in a flicker of movement, causing Taruho to sweat as he lost sight of him. The bespectacled attendant looked left and right, checking behind him and even above him for the next attack, frowning when he couldn't figure out what was going on. Wrong again. Before Taruho could realize what the slightly muffled voice meant, 4 fleshy snakes burst from the ground beneath him, coiling around him faster than he could move before tightening painfully. The attendant grunted from the sudden constriction as he lost his grip on his sword. He found he could barely move a muscle as one of the snakes suddenly appeared before his face, bared fangs dripping with a noxious-smelling, viscous purple fluid. Taruho. Shion tried to rush forward and help one of her oldest confidants. At the same moment Kusuna melted out of the ground as if it were water, grinning viciously at the captured swordsman. Little men holding pointy sticks should know better than to face a shinobi. We are your superiors in every way, samurai. The snakes suddenly released the man, allowing him to fall bonelessly to the ground, twitching from the pain of the poison. Shion wasted no time rushing over to his form, collapsing to her knees beside the man. All right, priestess, it's your turn now. Shion ignored the shinobi though, tears beginning to gather at the edges of her vision as she gently shook Taruho's unmoving arm. Taruho. She couldn't believe it. She had seen it, this exact moment, she had seen it in a vision, but she just couldn't believe it had actually happened. It was never supposed to be Taruho, not him. She just refused to believe it as she knelt there, shaking his body. No, Taruho, please, not you, please. More tears welled up in her eyes, staining her cheeks as they rolled uncontrollably down her pale skin. Well, Miko-sama, you really can show an emotion other than irritation. Shion's eyes widened a little as the body in front of her suddenly vanished in a puff of smoke. Behind her, Naruto suddenly descended from a high branch, quickly followed by a rather shell-shocked Taruho, the real one this time. But I think you should save your tears for now. The pale blonde just looked up, wiping at her eyes as she saw the very much real and alive form of her attendant standing right there. Taruho. She leapt at the man, catching him off guard as he was suddenly tackled to the floor. I thought you were. It was just like in my vision, I thought. She couldn't say any more as she buried her head in the sea of the closest thing she had to family since her mother passed. Taruho just smiled as he gently stroked her hair in a calming gesture. I am glad Shion-sama is safe. The two went ignored though as Naruto stood forward to face a very irritated Kusuna who was seething and already looking around for an escape. How? Naruto chuckled as he lazily swung his shakuju back and forth, the picture of innocence as the streaming light from above them lit him up. You aren't the only one that knows the henge. I'm just lucky Fu decided to teach me the substitution technique, it really came in handy here. A few seconds later and that would have really been Taruho infected by the horrible chakra you guys use. Kusuna continued to seethe as he slowly backed up, knowing he was no match for the young monk. The plan had been to lure him away long enough to deal with the priestess with the dark chakra clone, but even that hadn't worked. It doesn't matter, monk, we'll get the priestess eventually. Even you can't stand against Maryu-sama's full might. He made to dart from the clearing but found his path blocked by great walls of sand that had risen up without him even noticing. He turned fearfully to see Naruto striding toward him, eyes set and shakuju held firmly in his hand. I showed you the folly of attacking the priestess back at the temple. Quote. Kusuna rushed forward, hoping to blindside the monk with a quick attack, but Naruto wasn't fooled, easily diverting the punch to the side with his staff before striking him solidly in the sea with 2 outstretched fingers. You didn't listen. Kusuna gaped as he felt his right arm go completely numb, falling limply to his side. I told you politely not to attack us again after leaving the temple. 10 fleshy snakes suddenly burst from Kusuna's back, all aiming their S-venom for the young monk. However, once again it was ineffective as Naruto's hands began to warp the air from the heat radiating off of them. He lashed out, scorching and burning the snakes like they were paper the moment they got anywhere near him, before one again lashing out with another lightning-infused palm strike. This time it was Kusuna's other side that went limp, effectively leaving him defenseless before his frighteningly calm opponent. Quote. And again you failed to listen. At this point Kusuna's eyes had gone wide with fear as he found his back up against the intimidating wall of sand. To the side, Shion and Taruho had broken out of their reverie and were looking at the confrontation with shock. Thin but strong arms of sand burst from the makeshift wall, wrapping around the rogue shinobi and binding him there firmly. This time I'm not going to ask you, or show you. Naruto's eyes hardened as he brought his shakuju around in a smooth flourish, spinning it elegantly. Quote. I am going to tell you. With a powerful jab, Naruto s the end of the old monk's tool straight into Kusuna's sea, sending the shinobi crashing through the wall of sand in a surprising display of strength. When he stepped through the gaping hole he had made, he saw his opponent lying weakly on the ground, unable to move his body or even access his chakra anymore. You aren't going to hurt anybody anymore, because now you can't. Hesitantly, Shien and Taruho followed him through the hole in the sand construct that was now beginning to dissipate back into the earth. Kusuna suddenly twitched on the ground, his veins becoming more pronounced and turning a darker, sicklier purple. His skin became pale and pallid as before the three's very eyes. His body seemed to wither away, becoming thin and weak. What's happening to him? Shien was staring in disgust as the man just seemed to age a few decades before their eyes, withering away to a mere husk of his former self. I took away his ability to use chakra. Without it he can no longer control the darker chakra that's been implanted into his body. As if to prove that a multitude of those horrible fleshy snakes burst from the man's body, quickly wriggling away before they too simply dissipated into a noxious purple smoke. So he's still alive. Naruto nodded grimly, never taking his eyes off of the desiccated shinobi. But he'll never be a threat to anybody ever again. That dark chakra he so recklessly used will see to that. Finally, when the defeated man stopped twitching but Naruto was still sure he was alive, he looked away, letting out a deep breath. Right, we should go find the others. We still have a job to do, right? Shien took one last look at the withered husk of a man lying on the ground before wiping away the last of the tears staining her cheeks and nodding determinedly. The group had managed to find each other again not long after their individual fights were over, continuing the dash across country towards Numa no Kuni. They had arrived very close to where the sealing ground was hidden just as the moon was reaching its zenith in the sky. Despite protests to the contrary from Shien, they had all agreed it would be best to wait a night before continuing, so they were all well rested for what was to come. Even Taruho agreed, although that was unsurprising considering how exhausted the man appeared after the almost day-long sprint. However, once they had all gotten ready to sleep and the briefly lit campfire had been extinguished, a lone shadow slipped out of their tent. They made sure to make a wide passage around Fuu's tent as they knew the mint-haired girl was quite possibly the lightest sleeper ever. Finally they breathed a small sigh of relief as they got a sufficient distance from the campsite, looking out toward the direction of the sealing ground. Going somewhere, Miko-sama. The poor priestess nearly jumped out her skin as the soft voice suddenly spoke up from above her. She looked up with jerky, robotic movements to see Naruto look down at her with an amused expression from his position standing horizontally on the trunk of a tree. I needed the bathroom. Naruto just raised an eyebrow as he dropped from the tree, landing without even a whisper of sound next to the startled priestess. So far from the camp. Shien stuttered for a moment before scowling at the teen, crossing her arms over her sea as the fire relit in her. Yes, what of it? Naruto just shrugged nonchalantly, walking back in the direction of the camp with a small chuckle. Nothing. Have a nice night, Miko-sama. Shien watched the boy go for a few moments to check he was really gone before breathing a long sigh of relief. Quickly and as quietly as she could, she took off in the other direction, this time jogging so she could get away from the others as quickly as possible. It was only after another few minutes of running through the forest that she finally broke out of the tree line, finding herself standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down over the site of the sealing shrine. Wow, you really like your privacy if you need to go this far. Shien just nodded absently before blanching, looking around slowly to see Naruto right next to her, crouching down to look over the sealing site with an interested expression. What are you doing here? She nearly screamed it but managed to control herself and simply ground it out between clenched teeth in a hoarse whisper. Naruto simply looked around and edged his head in mock confusion before grinning disarmingly, catching the young priestess off guard. I promised you I would protect you, didn't I? That includes when you foolishly run off so you don't have to endanger the people you care about anymore. Shien felt her body go limp with surprise for a moment before she managed to catch herself, scowling at the teen. What are you talking about, monk? I came out here because I saw no reason to wait any longer. You only give those shinobi more time to get here. Naruto sighed with a lilting smile on his face as he turned back towards the sealing ground. The entire area outside of it was littered with odd mounds of recently disturbed earth. What makes you think they aren't here already? He casually picked up a small pebble before throwing it in a long arc through the air. It landed with a scrabbling sound near the middle of the large, flat area outside of the cave where Mariu was sealed. All of a sudden the closest of the burial mound-like structures burst open, revealing a tall, broad statue like being covered in intricate, traditional armor that looked around for a few moments for the source of the disturbance. When it didn't find anything it squatted back down, piling earth back on top of itself as camouflage. It never heard Xian's slight gasp of surprise. Mariu's ghost army, and I was about to walk out there. Xian paled at the thought of walking out amongst hundreds of virtually invulnerable stone soldiers that wouldn't hesitate to destroy her without mercy or even conscious thought. You know, I'm almost surprised you would do something so noble. Xian shook her head, Naruto's voice managing to somehow worm into her mind and settle her doubts for the moment. It just had a very soothing effect on her, at least until she thought back to what he actually said. Stop twisting my actions, monk. I already told you I just didn't see the point in waiting any longer. Naruto just smiled at her, absently blowing a stray lock of his hair away from his face. Sure, and it had nothing to do with Taruho. Xian froze at that, looking at the other blonde with shock while he simply looked out over the plateau again. What do you mean? Naruto chuckled before sighing lightly, still avoiding Xian's gaze. You know, it isn't a sign of weakness to say you are doing something for the sake of another. In fact, all my life I have seen examples of people becoming truly strong because they have chosen to fight or act in the protection of their loved ones. Xian seemed a little lost as the monk finally turned to her, his deep rippled eyes meeting hers. But, how can I do it? Xian looked down, her shoulders shaking slightly as she felt the emotional walls she had spent years building up cracking under the monk's soft gaze. One day I'll wake up, my bell will ring and I'll see his death. Then I will just have to wait for it, unable to do anything to stop it. She jerked a little when he felt Naruto rest his hand on her shoulder, making her look up. You can't believe that just because you see the future doesn't mean there's nothing you can do to stop it. You have to keep hoping that there is some way to change it. Lose that hope and then there really is nothing to do but wait and watch it happen for real. He smiled lightly and held out his hand while Xian just stared at it dumbly. Come on, just this once I'll let you be selfish. After a small moment's hesitation Xian gently took the offered hand, however she was unprepared as Naruto suddenly took off from the ground, leaping right over the plateau and taking her with him. What are you doing? She thought her voice might have been lost in the rushing winds as the two practically glided through the air, however Naruto seemed to hear her anyway, turning and smiling at her. For just a moment the young monk was framed by the moon, the ethereal light it cast making his golden hair glow, and just like that Xian lost her voice. The moment passed though, and after another few seconds they touched down softly on the other side of the plateau, right next to the mouth of the cave. Right, go on then, I'll be with you in a few minutes. Xian blinked, looking between the blonde and the cave entrance. She could practically feel the great power that was locked inside. You aren't coming. Naruto just smiled comfortingly as he gestured backwards with his hand. I'll be dealing with those. Xian looked over his shoulder to see the multitude of earthen mounds begin to break apart, revealing the intimidating stone warriors encased within. Are you going to be okay? Naruto simply grinned, holding up a strange cross-like hand seal she had never seen before. In a few puffs of bright white smoke there were suddenly 5 other Narutos standing in a line. I'll be fine, now go on, you'll be fine on your own for a bit. He turned, facing the oncoming army of supposedly invulnerable soldiers approaching them slowly. However Xian was frozen in place, unable to move out of fear. She didn't know what awaited her in that cave. It could be anything from one of the shinobi to Mariu himself. As if sensing her trepidation, the original Naruto turned to her even as the others dashed off, reappearing at the edges of the plateau, surrounding the army. It's alright Xian, you're stronger than you think, just remember what you are doing this for. Xian looked up at the older blonde with wide eyes. That was the first time he had called her by her actual name. Thank you, Naruto. The blonde just grinned as he turned to the oncoming horde, allowing Xian to turn and jog into the ominous dark of the cave. The blonde just grinned at the approaching warriors, slipping into an identical stance to the one being taken by the rest of his clones. Xian turned back to see the blonde one last time just as he began his technique, allowing her to witness something incredible. Each blonde took a deep breath, calming themselves as they limbered up their muscles before their eyes snapped open, each whispering as one. Mizu no Mai, Itaika. Then, just like that, the blondes vanished in perfect synchronization. They were mere blurs, darting and dodging through the stone soldiers like water through pebbles in a stream. They would simply lay their hands on one of the statues and in mere moments it would crumble away into dust, the chakra leaving its body. However, oddly, when they touched the next statue, nothing seemed to happen. In fact, they seemed to become a little bit faster. Shion worried, thinking Naruto's technique wasn't working. However, she began to notice it would happen every time. One touch would disintegrate, the other, empower. It was like some great, intricate dance as each Naruto sped through the ranks of the Ghost Army, each one slowly spiraling towards the center like the arms of a great whirlpool. It was hypnotizing to watch as they got progressively faster. At the same rate, the surviving statues seemed to become stronger. Shion shook herself out of her daze as she tore her eyes away from the amazing technique, turning and running off into the cave. She trusted Naruto to get through this. Finally, she emerged from the darkness of the cave into a vast, open area that seemed to stretch on into darkness in every direction without end. The entire place was lit by the bubbling lava across the round, the room only made passable by the intricate and complex series of earthen bridges, only a scant few feet above the dangerous molten rock below. The priestess didn't let that intimidate her as she walked on, toward the center of the great room, where the seal still bound Mariu's body. "You've grown." The voice stopped her in her tracks. It was deep, dark and unnatural, and her mind screamed at her to run from it even as her feet refused to budge. She turned slowly, spotting the dark-haired man that had been waiting for her, sitting slumped over in his regal chair. Slowly he looked up, revealing eyes that had lost their humanity long ago, eyes that froze her in place out of fear. "You look like Miraku." Naruto continued to duck and weave between the powerful stone golems, constantly pulling and pushing chakra in and out of the rock warriors. The whole basis of this technique was to whittle down the numbers of a very large crowd by pulling the chakra from some before immediately pushing it into others without even fully drawing it into his body. Luckily for him, it was perfect for this vile chakra, empowering the statues as he didn't want it in his body to begin with. It would probably destabilize his clones. The other principle was to mess with his opponent's control by pushing more chakra into their bi. However, in this case it only seemed to make the golems stronger. Either way, he continued with his dance, constantly aware of his clones' movements through the shared vision and their position in the larger spiral they were slowly creating. Eventually, as the numbers of statues continued to drop, their movements became faster and faster, as if reacting to some increasing tempo only they could hear. Then, finally, Naruto pivoted on his foot in perfect harmony with his clones, his hands in a double palm strike into the sea of one of the last statues. At the exact moment his clones did the same to theirs. He pushed all of the enormous chakra he had slowly gathered in his dance straight into the construct, watching it freeze from the sudden influx of the dark chakra. He took a step back, an action mirrored by his clones, watching as the sick remaining ghost warriors started to shake, the overload of chakra in there be too much for them to handle. He breathed a sigh of relief as the stone soldiers simply disintegrated from the enormous chakra in their artificial bi, running his head in direction of the cave. There was something there blocking his ability to sense fully, like there wasn't enough moisture in the air. However, he could see enough to know Shion was alive and had begun to perform the sealing ritual. There was another signature there, but it was weak and it didn't seem to be doing any. Shion. Naruto's eyes widened as the signature suddenly rocketed towards the girl, the previously weak chakra exploding outward into an almost oppressive presence. He turned to run towards the cave as his clones dissipated into smoke, only to be blocked off by even more of the stone golems. They were filtering in from the edge of the plateau, seemingly endless in their number. Naruto just growled at the ones that stood between him and the sealing shrine, building up the chakra within him to blinding levels. "I promised her I would protect her. I will not break that promise again. Now, get out of my way." In front of him, the ghost army just seemed to implode on themselves as the gravity around them magnified to unbearable levels, crushing rock into fine dust. However, as many as Naruto destroyed, there always seemed to be more, only existing to keep him away from the shrine where he could protect Shion. He spun on a heel, aiming to destroy another of the brutes when it suddenly froze in front of him. A moment later, the top half of it simply slid off the bottom half from a previously invisible sea. "I don't like it when you take off without me. I get worried. Naruto had never been happier to hear Fuu's slightly irritated tone as the girl dropped down beside him, water swords held firmly in hand. It's good to see you, Fu. Unfortunately, I need to go help our priestess. Think you can hold these things off? The mint-haired girl just nodded quickly as she bisected another of the lumbering golems, watching with thinly veiled interest as the two halves continued to walk forward for a few steps before crumbling away. Naruto used the opportunity to dash off, confident Fu would be able to handle herself. He darted into the cave, sprinting down the long passage that opened up into the great, lave-filled chamber. That at least explained why his water sense didn't seem to be able to work to its fullest. Naruto. He skidded to a halt as he looked over to where he could see Shion kneeling at the center of what looked to be a large, complicated ceiling array carved into the rock. He was just in time to see the ground around her break apart as huge tendrils of shadow burst from the earth, scattering stone and molten rock in all directions. At the same moment, the ground underneath Shion just seemed to give way beneath her, giving the priestess only a moment to lock her widened eyes with Naruto's before she fell into the chasm of darkness. Shion. Naruto froze for a moment, watching the girl fall before he was forced to dodge out of the way as a massive pillar of pure dark chakra down where he had been standing. He rolled to a stop, looking up at the four great dragon heads that had congealed from the solid chakra. They stared back at him with dark, glowing red eyes that seemed to mock him. Give her back. He could have sworn the dragons grinned before they rushed at him, each aiming to swallow him whole. He dodged them all, landing on another of the flimsy earthen walkways where he knelt for a few moments. The dragons recollected themselves, turning and roaring at the young blonde, seemingly mindless as Miryu's true consciousness was elsewhere. The air seemed to become still as Naruto finally looked up, opening his eyes slowly. However, when he did, the great demons seemed to rear back with cacophonous wails. They cried because Naruto's eyes had changed. They were now a startling gold. Shion was lost, floating in an endless void of darkness that had no end of beginning. There was nothing here, truly nothing. This was her end. The powers of her bell would not protect her forever, then. The girl tucked herself into a ball, closing out the dark chakra surrounding her, willing it to just go away. However, the malevolent presence that was entwined within this place would never be so easy to defeat. Is this it, little priestess? Is this truly your end? To sit here and while away your time while the races of man crumble around you? Safe inside your little bubble. Shion tried to ignore the voice, but it was everywhere. It was the dark fog that surrounded her. It whispered and echoed in her mind even now. Do you not think there is a better way, little priestess? Join with me, return my full power to me, your mother understood. Shion looked up, spotting the small pinprick of light in the eternal darkness of this place. Mother. She didn't notice her little bubble of light slowly fade around her as she unfurled her body, looking up toward that glowing, hovering light. Shion. It really was her. Shion got to her knees, looking up at the light as she reached out a hand, her protective sphere of light weakening and flickering around her. The darkness around her seemed to sense the weakness, the fog and mist seemingly drawing in closer around the young teen. Yes, just accept it, little priestess. Give in to me, be with your dear mother again. Shion reached out, feeling as though she could almost touch the little hovering light. However, just before she did, she froze, fingers only a few inches away. No. Naruto's words flashed through her mind as she took her hand back. She had to remember why she was here, to protect the people she cared about. She couldn't do that if she gave up. She would be letting Miryu win. No, she wouldn't allow it. No. She pulled back, the bright light around her strengthening as the dark voice seemed to scream in pain. I understand now, this power. She gripped the bell pinned to her jacket as the light became blinding, casting back the shadowy fog. However, before she could fully release the power contained within her, she froze as a warm hand rested on her shoulder. You've done great, Shion. She looked around, tears brimming in her eyes as her young monk stepped up beside her, a soft smile on his face as he gazed at her with brilliant golden eyes. Naruto. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.